What should the world expect from the Trump-Putin summit in Helsinki? Accusations of election tampering, the war in Syria, Ukraine and arms control are issues at stake between the US and Russia. So will the two leaders reach a common ground? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the program. I am Hashem Ahelbarra. US President Donald Trump and Russian leader Vladimir Putin are expected to hold their first one-on-one meeting in Helsinki on Monday. But the two leaders will hold some of those meetings without their aides, and that's worrying diplomats. Trump has been under pressure to cancel the summit altogether. That's after the US Justice Department charged 12 Russians with hacking the Democratic Party and Hillary Clinton during the 2016 election campaign. President Trump has promised to confront Putin on the issue. We'll bring in our guests shortly, but first, this report from our diplomatic editor, James Bass.
Helsinki, a city that during the Cold War was used as one of the few places where Western allies and the Soviet Union could talk. Some believe relations are almost at a Cold War level again, yet one leader keeps talking up the positive.
And I said, Putin may be the easiest of them all. You never know.
The biggest blow to relations was Russia's seizure of Crimea from Ukraine, the first time a part of one country had been stolen by another in Europe since World War II. At the time, it was condemned by the US, NATO and the EU. However, in recent days, at two news conferences in Belgium and the UK, President Trump was asked if Russia should give back Crimea, and each time he dodged the question.
What will happen with Crimea from this point on, that I can't tell you. Well, we'll have to see what happens.
Far from here, the Syrian war seems to be entering its final phases. The Assad regime, with support from its allies Iran and Russia, has the upper hand. The US and Israel want to reduce Iranian presence in the country and its influence in the region. Could there be a grand bargain in the works? Only days ago, Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu was in Moscow. Putin could perhaps persuade Assad to ask Iran to leave his country. Trump could lift objections to Russia's control of Crimea. Far-fetched? Perhaps. But just listen to the way the Ukrainian ambassador to the UN is clinging to previous statements by members of the US administration on Crimea.
I think that, and that was confirmed several times by many other U.S. officials, from Mr. Bolton to the spokesman for the White House and many other officials who confirmed that the principal policy of the U.S. will stay the same, that the illegal annexation of Crimea by Russia should never be recognized.
Remarkably, for part of this summit in Finland's presidential palace, Trump is likely to meet Putin alone, just as he did in Singapore with Kim Jong-un in June. The US's closest allies are worried what this most unpredictable president might agree to behind these walls. James Bass, Al Jazeera, Helsinki.
Just a few days ahead of that meeting, the US Department of Justice charged 12 Russian intelligence officers for hacking into the emails of Hillary Clinton's staff during the 2016 presidential campaign. It's the first time US officials have directly charged Russia's government of meddling. The indictment says the defendants stole documents from computers belonging to Clinton and her Democratic Party and made them public while working for the Russian military intelligence. Those accused allegedly used a technique called spear phishing, where they sent emails with virus attached and the spying software. Russia's foreign ministry has denied the allegations and says the indictment was timed to damage the upcoming summit in Helsinki. Let's bring in our panel. Joining us from the US state of Virginia, Thomas Pickering, who is a former US ambassador to Russia. In Berlin, Thorsten, director of the Global Public Policy Institute. And in Moscow, Pavel Felgenhaeur, a columnist at Novaya Gazeta, on defense and military affairs. Welcome to you all. Thomas, I would like to ask you this particular question about the upcoming summit. Do you think it is definitely going to be a confrontational one, given the mounting pressure from both countries?
No, I don't. I think President Trump remains totally unpredictable. So anything I have to tell you here is based on the best guess. President Trump has continued over years to, in one way or another, soft pedal, flatter, coddle President Putin, with the idea in mind, obviously, that at some point he's going to be able to use that as a successful way to negotiate something with President Putin that can redound to his advantage. After all, President Trump is, in many ways, the classic ego narcissist. And what he achieves is very much his own publicity and his own self-promotion. Ideas of U.S. interests seem to be secondary, much as they were in Singapore with Kim Jong-un, when at the end he stepped forward and said quite unexpectedly he was ending military cooperation and exercises with the Republic of Korea, something that no one expected, and apparently something for which he got nothing or very little in return. So there is deep uncertainty. America is divided, and President Trump and the Republican Party, and most of the stalwarts and most of the people that the good Ukrainian ambassador just spoke about are people who don't share Trump's unpredictability, his rather benign views about President Putin.
Okay.
And that division is there, but not controlling, as we have seen this week in two really quite disastrous meetings at NATO and with Mrs. May, in which Trump acted up on his own. So expect the unknown, the unpredicted, the unorthodox coming out of this meeting from President Trump.
Okay. Thorsten, do you think this is going to be about substance, or the fireworks will ultimately just boil down to the style of the meeting?
It's hard to tell, but certainly Europeans are worried. These are two leaders meeting who share a distaste for a strong Europe, a distaste for liberal democracy, a distaste for the truth, a distaste for alliances. And Trump has already been wrecking the Atlantic alliance during his trip to Brussels and London this week. And many Europeans asked what worse is in store. At the same time, I think Mr. Trump has said, like, Putin may be the easiest of them all. I don't agree with that. The meeting with President Putin will be very tough for Mr. Trump. It was easy to use the allies in Brussels as just support actors that can be shouted at and pushed around and denigrated. He cannot do that with President Putin, and it will be very hard to come up with a result that he can brand as a success. It will be much harder than at the Brussels meeting.
Pavel, the meeting will come against the backdrop of the indictment of 12 Russian intelligence officers by the United States Department of Justice. Is this something which is likely to top the agenda of the meeting between the two leaders?
Well, surely it won't top the agenda. Neither President Putin, neither President actually Trump wants to talk about that or interested to talk about that. Well, maybe for the record, Trump will say, I mentioned it, all right? Told Putin that it is not good, and that's it. And he's more or less speaking at the press conference this Thursday in Brussels. Trump sort of said, well, yes, I'll mention Russian interference, and that's it. He'll say that, and Putin will say he doesn't. Well, that's the end of story. They have a big lot on their plate already. I believe both sides, both presidents really want to have a deal. And maybe a deal is coming. I don't know, but they both want it.
Ambassador,
and these things, I mean, with the elections and with the Russian interference, that's not what Trump is interested at all.
Well, it remains to be, but that's not the sentiment voiced by the American people, who are pretty much concerned. Ambassador Pickering, National Security Advisor Bolton said that he doesn't believe that Putin didn't have any knowledge about the meddling, Russian meddling into the 2016 election. Is this something which is likely going to be a top priority for President Trump during the meeting?
No, I agree with my old friend Pavel. I think President Trump has already signaled that, of course, he will do the necessary and raise the question. And he said yesterday, as the pressure and the heat on him from the United States grew, that he had never thought of extradition. But we all know there's no extradition treaty. We all know that Russia doesn't extradite its own nationals. It's just a point of one way or another seeing if he can satisfy some complaints. But his own ignorance of the details and the facts and the situation come through time and time again. I think the really interesting question is whether they can come to an agreement. I don't believe the question of election meddling or indeed the 12 indictments in one way or another is going to block the meeting or the progress that they hope to achieve. The real deep concern in the United States is that Putin is so well prepared, so much the master of the situation, so much the kind of forceful presenter of his own view, that he in one way or another will roll President Trump, much the way that Kim Jong-un did. The interesting question here is there are three levels of possible outcomes here. One is the lower level in which things like perhaps the reestablishment of some of the consulates, opening up of a little bit of relationships, bringing some more diplomats back, some trade issues and things of that sort. The second level, much more important, is things like Syria and how to deal with that. And the third level is obviously the question of the nuclear equation between the two, the uncertainties that have become, I think, more dominant and more, I think, difficult and perhaps dangerous in the situation over INF and nuclear weapons numbers and things of that.
Thorsten, I mean, the two leaders are into the thick of major differences about big issues. Let's start with the annexation of Crimea. What is it that the Americans can hope to change now when it's almost too late? We're talking about almost 3 years after the event took place.
Look, what Pavel said is like, what kind of deal is possible? And Europeans are rightly worried that a deal will be concluded over their heads on issues such as the European security order. Europeans, especially Eastern Europeans, are very worried that Mr. Trump may agree to canceling the military exercises on NATO's eastern flank as a gesture toward President Putin. On Ukraine, if they can achieve progress without selling out Ukraine and its interests, that would be very welcome. On Syria, if they can achieve progress without selling out civilians, that would be welcome. Similarly, on arms control, progress would be welcome. But it really depends on the terms that will be agreed among the two leaders.
Pavel, are the Russians prepared for any source of concessions when it comes to to Crimea?
No, on Crimea there will be no concessions, and actually Crimea is not right now being discussed. I mean, Trump cannot possibly legally kind of grant Crimea to Putin, and de facto Putin already has Crimea. I believe that the outcome of the summit is going to be some kind of declaration. That there's some kind of de-escalation declaration, that both sides are going to work for further progress, and there's going to be follow-on talks between the Secretary of State and the Russian Foreign Minister and so on. But on really what's going to happen and can happen in the direct talks between Putin and Trump, that they can reach some kind of handshake agreement. Both leaders like and they prefer such kind of agreements. Trump is a businessman, Putin with the so-called patsan culture in Russia, where unofficial agreements are much more important than the ratified and signed treaties. And they can agree basically on Iran. America wants to center right now very big pressure on Iran. Russia could kind of maybe stand aside and be officially against, but not intervene. And for Putin, the most important thing is Ukraine.
We will talk about those issues one by one. Ambassador Pickering, when it comes to the arms control deal, the new Strategic Arms Reduction Treaty, which expires in 2021, What are the likely scenarios? Are we going to see both parties agree on how to move forward?
There are two likely scenarios. One, which President Putin raised last year on the telephone, and President Trump didn't know what it was, but he consulted his advisors, and they said, oh, that was Obama, you don't want to do that. We may have moved on from that. It certainly would make sense to do that. And the idea that there would be a handshake and that would be continued, as Pavel has outlined, I think makes a certain amount of sense. Certainly Trump would prefer that. Trump can't take anything from this particular set of conversations with President Putin back to the United States for congressional endorsement. The situation is too difficult now. The demonization of Russia is too extensive. The rifts are too great. The distrust of Mr. Putin is so great. What we are seeing potentially is something like Singapore, where the two go in, where they come out with a communique, which really is a blah, blah, blah document, says very little, makes no commitments. There may be some handshakes that get revealed later on, as I described, and then we'll see where it goes. But Mr. Putin and Mr. Trump will emerge from this, certainly perhaps echoing the notion that they have made some real progress and some agreement, because each will benefit from it in their own way. And that will be something that is important to watch. But the content, I think, will be equally disappointing and will, in a sense, roll out the bit the way the North Korean has. Pompeo will have an impossible job, and he will continue to be rebuffed at each stage and putting anything from the summit into concrete shape.
Thorsten, the last few days were really interesting in the sense we've seen Trump lambasting allies in the EU, Canada, and also NATO. You go to the US, to Russia, you go to Helsinki to meet with Trump when you have been sending disparaging remarks against your own allies in the region. Isn't this something that could diminish his leverage or whatever leverage he might have in talking with Putin?
I don't think it diminishes Mr. Trump's leverage. Mr. Putin is rightly suspicious on whether Mr. Trump could deliver on any promises he may make to him. Mr. Trump may be unhinged, but he's not unconstrained, and he has Congress and also parts of his own administration that are deeply distrustful of any outreach to Mr. Putin, any deals that could be made. For Europeans, of course, this is a terrible situation to see these two anti-Europeans congregate and hash out plans that could very much be harmful to Europeans. At the same time, it's a reminder that we Europeans need to come up with our own agenda vis-à-vis Russia. German Foreign Minister Maas has talked about a new Ostpolitik that we need to devise. What's our vision for a European security order that includes Russia, for outreach to Russia, for dealing with Russia? I think it's a reminder that we shouldn't leave that to Trump and Putin, but that we need to make our own policies on that front.
Pavel, the Americans say that the Russians are not reliable when it comes to reducing the nuclear warheads. The Russians, on the other hand, accuse NATO and the Americans of expanding eastwards towards Russia. How can they potentially make some concessions when it comes to both, or find some common ground when it comes to those differences?
Well, when in the kind of counting of warheads thing, well, there we have still the START 3 treaty. It could be prolonged. Basically, that's good enough. We have problems with INF. That's a serious issue. But that's most likely not what Putin and Trump are going to be talking about. I don't think that Trump is very much interested in counting warheads at all. Trump right now, in the region of the Middle East and in general, his main aim is to put maximum pressure on Iran. And he's not very much interested in the defense of the Baltics or with Ukraine, and he said so. So there's a kind of convergence of interest. If Russia stands aside when Trump zeroes in very hard pressure on Iran, American, in return, could sort of stand aside when Russia puts more pressure on Ukraine to press it into concessions. And that I see as a possible deal that they could make. The interests of the two men, if not they coincide, at least they're not against each other.
Okay, Ambassador Pickering, but don't you think that this could be the right moment to take on President Putin? The man faces problems internally, rising fuel prices, a plan to increase retirement age, which is creating some problems internally. Couldn't this be an opportunity for the Americans to push Putin into concessions?
Trump has two ways of dealing with people, depending upon how he sees them. Strong people that he admires and he thinks are significant and can deliver, probably in part because they come from systems that are very authoritarian, he flatters, he cozies up to. He in public says what wonderful people they are. Sometimes he threatens them ahead of time, but stage two is where he gets the delivery. And he hopes to get that delivery, I think, with President Putin on the basis that honey gets much further than vitriol. We'll wait and see. People he doesn't respect get the hard treatment. Mrs. May did, the NATO partners did, and so on. And the hard treatment is designed to break them down so that when it comes time to strike the deal, at the end, he sees himself in a superior position. The really interesting question is whether President Putin can really deliver on Iranian evacuation from Syria, which is clearly what President Trump would like. Anything that in one way or another punishes or pushes Iran around would be useful for him. Bibi Netanyahu likes it. He's been to see President Putin. But President Assad doesn't like it. And President Assad, in one way or another, has a certain command of the situation that can't be totally ignored, particularly because he's been able to expand with Russian help his capacity to deal in southwestern Syria, one of the uncontrolled areas of the government, in a way that has pushed the others, the rebels and the others away, and created more position for himself there. And Iranian help has been unusually important there. So whether a deal can be made, whether Iran can be pushed back, say, 80 kilometers from the border, which the Israelis would like, that'll be an interesting question. We will have to wait and see whether that can happen and whether, in fact, President Putin can deliver on that.
On that particular issue of Syria, I would like to raise this issue with Thorsten. People would say at the same time, why would you blame Trump for mistakes that were not made under his watch? Syria is seen by many as a blunder by the Obama administration.
Syria is certainly a blunder by all Western actors, by all actors involved, and it's a crime on the part of the Russian administration that has done so much to destroy lives in Syria, and that's something Mr. Trump should definitely bring up with Mr. Putin. And now Syria is, of course, also Mr. Trump's problem, as the Assad forces are closing in on those areas that are still held by rebels or by forces that are allied or used to be allied with the U.S. There's quite a bit to discuss, but I share Ambassador Pickering's skepticism that Russia would be able to deliver on Iran. Okay,
Pavel, in less than a minute, please. Now that the Russians have made significant impact in Russia, do you think in Syria, do you think they are willing to make a compromise that would set aside Iran and pave the way for a permanent peace in Syria?
Well, at least Putin can promise he'll do his best. And also, of course, Syria is important for Russia, but not as important as Ukraine. The main problem right now for Putin is to do something with Ukraine. The status quo is unacceptable, and that's where his main interest is going to lie. Compromises on Syria are possible.
I see your point. Thank you very much indeed for your contribution. Thomas Pickering, Thorsten Benner, Pavel Felgenhaeur, thank you very much indeed for your contribution to the program. And thank you too for watching. You can see the program again anytime by visiting our website, aljazeera.com. For further discussion, go to our Facebook page. That's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. You can also join the conversation on Twitter. Our handle is @AJInsideStory. From me, Hashem, Ahelbarra, and the whole team here, bye for now.